We are joined today by Jeffrey Ansloos,
Both
who
work.
is which one?
Both work.
Both work. So Jeff
Yeah.
and Jeffrey, no, who is at the University of Toronto. But I'll turn it over to you, Jeff, if you want to just do a brief introduction.
Sure. Yeah. Well, Tansei, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Jeffrey Ansloos. My family comes from Fisher River Cree Nation. I grew up in Winnipeg. I work and live in Toronto now, working at the University of Toronto at the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education. Happy to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. This is a pretty serious and heavy topic. And before we get started, I just want listeners to know that we're going to be talking about suicide in this podcast episode. And Jeff was kind enough to maybe do a little bit of background on some resources for listeners that they can access. Jeff, do you have any recommendations, or do you want to just give some context to what we're going to be talking about in case folks have some questions?
Sure. Yeah, for sure. So we definitely are going to be discussing some sensitive topics today that relate to death, suicide as a particular kind of death, and other challenging issues that intersect with that. And these topics are difficult ones. They evoke a lot of deep pain and emotion in a lot of us as individuals and certainly as a people. And at the same time, I know that like our love for our communities are partly why we have these conversations and might draw you to listen to an episode like this, even though it can be painful. And a lot of us working in these areas and thinking about these issues also live with these issues in like the most intimate, proximal parts of our lives. And I just want to, express respect for your wisdom and how you think about how you participate. Maybe this is like a conversation you want to listen to with other people. Maybe it's a conversation you want to listen to in the morning, not late at night. And I just, think about as you listen to an episode like this to bring a good heart and a good mind and a lot of compassion for all that the kind of topics might stir, including pain, which is also a really important teacher. There are lots of resources available to you should you want to talk to somebody. I mentioned earlier, I'll make my own contact available if you want to reach out to me to get connected to some of these resources. But depending on where you are in the world, those resources may look different and the contact lines may be different. But in Canada, I'll provide the Hope for Wellness line, which is a 24-hour call service where you can call and you can speak to somebody about what you're going through. And that service is available in Inuktitut, in Cree, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee. And there's an opportunity to speak to somebody as well as in French and English. In the United States, there's the 988 number, which is a suicide prevention and support line that you can always reach out to, and you'll get connected to trained counselor who will be able to support you and direct you to resources wherever you live. I know that there's lots of people who tune in from all around the world. So if you're looking for some support and you don't know where to go, wherever you are, please reach out and I'll do my best to connect you to colleagues and folks who care wherever you are. And then there's also just lots of really good resources to read about these issues online. One that I really think speaks deeply to the lives of many Indigenous people is a resource called wisepractices.ca, where it profiles a lot of community initiatives and community responses where First Nations are showing up and just lifting each other up in moments where we need to think about what it takes to create conditions for living. And so those are some resources I'll share. And if you want more, let me know.
Yeah, thanks for that. And for those who are listening or watching, we will put these links in the show notes. So if you are interested in accessing them or sharing them with others, please do so. And you can find them in the podcast or YouTube notes in the episode description. So thanks for that, Jeff. And you sent me a reading list to kind of review this topic, and I'll be honest, I've never actually read any scholarly study of Native suicide, so I don't have any background. I know that there's been a lot of sort of epidemiological studies on this issue. I know it's been very much pathologized in terms of medical sort of and psychiatric pathologization of Native people. I remember encountering it as a young person, that, we're high risk, for suicide, but never really understanding like why, other than the sort of individualization of this experience. And it really wasn't until I got older that I really began to understand the sort of structure, or at least making connections structurally, that like, typically after reading your work and, kind of having my own moment of self-reflection, in my own personal experience, I'll just full disclosure for those who are listening, I've had family members who have attempted, who have also committed, suicide, and on both my white side and my Native side. For those who are listening, it's not just something that is, a Native issue in that context, but nonetheless is related very structurally to settler colonialism, and I would say also very related to our relationship to the land, and in the case of my community, the water. The damming of our river, the destruction of our water source. Had a deleterious impact on our community that we're living with. Generationally, we may not know that. But I think doing that sort of historical research and understanding that this was a recent sort of theft and destruction that led to displacement, but also a fundamental shift in how we relate to the land, and especially the water itself. And it isn't, a metaphor, as you so I think poignantly point out in your work, that just as much as decolonization isn't a metaphor, as Yvetok and Wayne K. Yang point out, water is life is also, not a metaphor. But these are sort of big topics, but I want to hear from you about how you came to this work. What was your sort of personal experience? As Native scholars, we tend to, we write about our communities, for a variety of reasons, but I want to just hear your sort of story about how you came to this.
Yeah. Thanks. I mean, these are really powerful questions, and how I came to this work was not one strand. I would say there's been kind of like many points to this kind of constellation of moments that led me to this work. At a fairly young age, there were people in my world who died by suicide, or were living with the desire to die. I was actually reflecting on this recently with a colleague. How young was I when I knew what suicide was? And I would say it was quite young, probably four or 5 years old, which says something about the kind of world and the pervasiveness of this issue in terms of its impact on many different communities, actually, but certainly our communities. As a teenager, though, I think, my first sort of substantial experiences with depression and navigating that was a place where I started to really recognize how close that desire lived in my own life, and wrestled with questions about living. Probably in my mid-teens is when that started. And then had a lot of friends who went through that and went through various attempts. And so, it's kind of as long as I recall, it was something that was very intimately affecting me personally, and certainly affecting the lives of my friends. And when I went to university was the first time I knew somebody very closely who I'd consider a close friend who died by suicide. And I started training as a psychologist, not directly because of those issues, but they certainly shaped my path to that work. And then working as a psychologist, I started realizing how, I wouldn't say universal, but how, just how widely people navigate this question of living. And that in many ways, the kinds of responses that contemporary therapeutic cultures offer are so vapid and don't actually often address what are the sources of despair, and often fail to reckon with the kinds of like, enduring um, structures that produce that kind of pain. Um, and yeah, I think I started to just feel a great dissatisfaction with that. Kind of a deep sense of like what we were offering is not sufficient to address these kinds of experiences of pain. And for a long time, I really did that work from the position of like working with people who are navigating that desire. I'd say in the last decade, a lot of my work has also started to include working with people who live in the wake of that kind of loss, people who are grieving the death of a loved one, or people who are trying to make sense of life in the wake of this desire being kind of in the midst of their family or their community. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I found myself doing this work. But when I really made a commitment to think about my vocation in relationship to serving my people and Indigenous peoples around North America, where I've lived, I really started to think about how to produce a more politically energized and structurally reflective approach to the question of suicide, because I see that as broadly missing, and it truncates the entire conversation that even our communities often have about this issue into something that is only understood through the lens of like, oh, you're suicidal, that means you're depressed, that means you need mental health supports, and so forth. I wanted really the political analyses of Indigenous studies and and other social and political thought to energize a different way of thinking about this issue, and maybe how we respond to it, both individually but also collectively.
Yeah, that's really important, and I think I didn't know you were a psychologist, by the way, so that's really fascinating. And I think a lot about how I was introduced to concepts such as like excuse me, historical trauma, and this idea of loss, and even outside, like I think of a lot like the question of suicide, and it's sort of as related to the question of like alcoholism or substance abuse and use within Native communities, and how there tends to be sort of a pathologization around this. And even though it's like we hear it every day, we don't really have a lot of language to talk about it, and it's often within a deficit model. And one thing that I've always really pushed back against, especially around the historical trauma framing, which I think there's merits to it, but I'm also like, is this the permanent state of being? Because if it is the permanent state of being, then it sort of traps us as individuals within this kind of framework of like trying to work out our own individual trauma, but not really understanding or not really being given the tools or even the imagination to think about this in a structural sort of, a structural way. And I think part of that is because we think of colonization as like an external force, which it is very much. It colonizes the land, colonizes water, it extracts resources, it does all these things. But that is also something we've internalized in many ways. And it's not just a sort of abstract internalization, as you point out. And it's a very material internalization, meaning that when you are denied material sustenance or dignity through a lack of access to water or clean drinking water or just a healthy environment. A healthy environment, I think of that in a holistic sense, not just one related to a kind of rote environmentalism. I think those factors tend to get obscured a little bit because they seem insurmountable, right? Because settler colonialism has made itself a sort of permanent structure and feature upon our life where we at every turn we encounter as Indigenous people, whether we choose to or not. We can't just disengage. Our work isn't just 9 to 5. It's everything. And I wanted to ask you about certain things that I don't know all audience, people listening to this podcast or watching it will quite understand, because I didn't quite understand until, I was in Ontario and I, spoke with a lot of people in the north. But can you explain things such as drinking water advisories and what a long-term drinking water advisory means?
Sure. So, at the most basic sense, drinking water advisory is a public health notice. It's a declaration, a political statement, or a health notice that is essentially attempting to mitigate the potential risks of infection and disease by virtue of the quality of water. And there are different types of these kinds of notices in the Canadian system. Those can be, water advisories that are do not consume this water, don't consume this water without boiling it, or don't touch this water. And when one of these kinds of advisories lasts for a period of 12 months or greater, it's considered long-term. These happen all the time. These happen in Canadian cities. These happen in American cities, where for whatever reason, maybe there's an overgrowth of bacteria in water, or there's spills, or for lots of different reasons, sewage overflowing. There can be reasons why water quality changes. And on top of that, sometimes like just the land changes in composition. Watersheds move. They come into contact with different kinds of ground quality and can just change. So sometimes water changes for reasons that are not so nefarious. But oftentimes water changes because of poor environmental stewardship or thoughtless, reckless treatment of the land. And in Canada, what's really important to note is that long-term drinking water advisories disproportionately impact Indigenous peoples' communities, First Nations, and Inuit communities in particular, at a rate that is so grossly disproportionate from the general public that you cannot help but understand and see it as a racialized form of violence. In one of my articles, I talk about this difference between a community that's had an almost 30-year long-term drinking water advisory, Neskantaga First Nation in Ontario, and a close neighboring city, Walkerton, Ontario, which had their water remediated within a month of a city of comparable geographic region, and yet there's this unremediated condition that's just continues to be unresolved in communities like Neskantaga. So there's clear evidence that these sort of long-term water advisories disproportionately impact Indigenous people. And they are particularly pronounced in ways that have to do with the do not consume, do not touch this water, only touch it through the use of boiling. And in many cases, more extreme circumstances where you could only use it for showering. And even if you're using it for showering, you're going to have skin conditions that result from the water quality. It's a really difficult set of circumstances that are, you said before, when colonization sort of feels permanent. I kind of refuse to let this situation remain permanent, but it certainly, I get why it feels that way. And I think that's actually part of the premise of how I want to rethink suicide, is that it's something that the kind of mental health world and the sort of psychological and psychiatric and biomedical determinism often frames as irrational, a feeling that is not sound of sound mind, but without valorizing necessarily the desire to die. I think one can look at it and go, hey, this makes sense in a position of like unremitting violence, that kind of pain emerges. To acknowledge that is actually, it's shocking to say, but to acknowledge that those feelings might be rational, that they exist in logics that are structured by colonialism is still quite radical, even in fields like psychology. Um, but yeah, that's the water question. I've drifted.
No. As it gets to this kind of follow-up question that I had, because you write a lot about how, there's infrastructures of water, that are purposefully, or I don't know if they're purposefully, they're under-maintained or they don't exist at all, to the point where it's like you just said, there's, you have decades of long-term drinking water advisories. It's not like this is unknown to the Ontario government or to the federal government. And I think it's just fascinating in a place like Ontario, which is a major concentration of wealth within Canada, that you have these communities living in a first world, living in the social welfare kind of beacon of a lot of, democratic socialists, or excuse me, social democrats in the United States and in Canada, who look to the social welfare state of Canada and like point to the sort of like public infrastructure as something that is worthy of replication, right, in other places, but not really understanding the kind of way that these. I'm avoiding the word purposeful, but the question of intent is always like lurking behind a lot of this, because when you say something like abandonment or neglect, it assumes, in my opinion, that there was intentional investment in the first place, and then somehow we're moving backwards. Like, there was a halcyon days of like, social welfare for Native people, and now we've abandoned those responsibilities. But I would say that maybe settler colonialism, there isn't an investment, because if the logic of elimination is to eliminate, the native, then where does this kind of enter into the fray? Is there an intent behind it, or is it just a logic of sort of death and sort of creating the circumstances that make certain populations more vulnerable for certain reasons? I don't know if that's too confusing.
No, well, I have a lot of opinions about it. So I mean, I think we can. Let's first do away with the myth of Canadian social welfare as like an enduring, strong system, because it is at every level being actively dismantled in every possible way, and that's not just for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. It's for all people living in this country. The impact of a kind of neoliberal capitalism on all social welfare is pronounced in every corner of our society, but nowhere perhaps more obviously than in our healthcare system. So I'm very comfortable. I would love for the whole world to know that Canada's a fraud on that front, because we are. But one thing that Canada, it's interesting that that's the story of Canada. Like Canada, the peacekeeper, like Canada, the anti-racist, like Canada, the reconciler. These are all tropes about Canada that are effective tactics of our marketing of this national project. But in fact, Canada's greatest replication of its state structures has been the exporting of the reserve system. It's been in the exporting of apartheid legislations like the Indian Act. It's been in the exporting of its political violence in Australia, in Aotearoa, in South Africa, in Palestine, where water has been used time and time again as a mechanism of state violence. And so I'm very comfortable naming the intention of that structure to do harm, that you can look at the sort of configuration of water infrastructure failures in Canada and see very clearly the ways that it moves across racial and political subjugations. But I also think it's, this move to sort of speak about the structure as intentional and maybe not comment too much on individuals, I think lets us as a people get away with too much. Like there have been leaders who are human beings charged with the responsibility of addressing these kinds of issues for the last 30 years in Canada, that have failed to act, or who have been willing to take legal action to shirk that responsibility. And I think about that, and I think that is personal. Like, that only happens in a society where the logics, the socialization to white supremacy, or the sort of settler colonial inevitabilities have been deeply inscribed and unquestioned. And perhaps the most pernicious or difficult aspect to navigate today is the fact that behind the current maybe reconciliation and recognition politics that play out in Canada is a structure that is still fundamentally built on apartheid, a structure that is still fundamentally driven by logics of extermination and disposability of Indigenous people. And you don't have to look very far to see that. You can see it in water, you can see it in housing, you can see it in the fact that the government goes to court every year to try to deny equitable access to health service payments for Indigenous people, and Indigenous kids get, around 60 cents to the dollar in terms of public spending in health and social services and education across the country. And that's been known and well documented for the better part of almost 50 years. And people have, I don't know, maybe I'll use the word moral responsibility to think and act in good relationship to that violence. But partly why I harp on the issue of really rethinking and questioning the assumptions of mental health as a framework is because I think what you were referencing earlier about trauma and the kind of we're living in the trauma informed era is it's an example of something that internalizes what is actually quite social. Violence between people is not something internal. It happens materially between us. But when we think and sort of frame these issues solely as individual responsibilities, it's 100% commensurate with the political and economic projects of a neoliberal, capitalist, settler colonial society. And so disrupting that is about insisting that individual people, like the Minister for Indigenous Services, like the Premier of Ontario, have personal as well as structural political responsibility. That, I think, pushes us away from trauma-informed to more violence-informed ways of thinking about these kinds of relationships to place.
Yeah, very much so. And I also, as I was reading your work and then hearing you talk, you say it's a kind of a radical idea to think about these sort of structural issues as informing, deaths by suicide, but also the sort of inverse of that, I guess, would be from an environmental studies standpoint or an environmental justice standpoint, is it also radical to say that deaths by suicide because of environmental factors is something that is not really well considered? I mean, you pointed out in some of your kind of assessments of environmental impact statements or assessments by governments, but also by corporations or industries who are going into these areas. I just want to know, how do you deal with these sort of critiques of how, I'm just thinking of this industry person was well, this person obviously had mental health issues. So it's not my fault that, we contaminated the water. It's this person's individual choice that they made. I mean, this is maybe I'm answering the question for you right now because it's
bullshit. It's such bullshit. I mean, am I allowed to say that? Sorry, I didn't realize.
You can say it. Go ahead.
Okay, it's total bullshit. Here's a good example. De Beers Mining Corporation extracting gold and other minerals and metals from Turtle Island and Australia and Central America. This giant multinational corporation. Their CEO runs a northern race to raise awareness about suicide in First Nations, runs across a highway built to transport precious metals runs that road to bring awareness to suicide in First Nations. A mining corporation in Manitoba that recently spilled toxic chemicals onto the water source called me, asking me where they should donate a few $1 million to the community to promote mental health and wellness. I don't think these mining corporations and extractive commercial industries are clueless. I think they understand very clearly that there are not only social impacts of extraction in communities that might produce some of the social conditions and dimensions of suicidality. So you can think about like the changes that industrialization brings to society, the shifts that temporary workers entering in and out of a community, the role of like gender-based violence that happens in mines and these sorts of things. Those all have ripple effects on health outcomes, right? But what I think is not unclear to these companies either is that when you poison the water, when you produce unlivable conditions that fundamentally alter a people's relationship, not only to one another, but to a place, and a place that has, we're from similar territory. So I know these places for us have spiritual significance. They're part of how our creation stories are told, that these relationships are sacred to us, and that when those material environments and all of the ways that they are so much more are become sites of industrial violence, I do not believe for a moment it is unclear to these companies that those are health impacts that can be traced to environmental change. The kind of moment for me, watershed moment for me, was in 2016. There was a cluster, a contagion of suicides that took place in and around Attawapiskat First Nation in Ontario. And Attawapiskat's connected to the Attawapiskat River system, and it's within the downstream of mining and fairly significant industrial mining. And
they call this area like the Ring of Fire, right?
The Ring of Fire, yes. Although in the Anishinaabe language, it's the place where the rivers meet. Which is quite a contrast of I would say like epistemologies and ontologies about land and water.
I didn't quite understand, like, when I was looking at some of this stuff. Is Ring of Fire a derogatory thing, or is it a thing of like, I was like, is this something that's like a vernacular of people who are criticizing industry, or is this what industry actually calls itself, like in that region? Like
this is part of it is just description of the deposit and how it's shaped. But there's I won't speak for those communities in the sense of like what it should be called, but I do know that there are differences of opinion about it. And one thing that really stood out to me with Attawapiskat is when this happened in the community, the government of Canada and even Trudeau, authorized these sort of emergency spending to send up a group of social workers to respond. They asked young people in that community, what would it take for Nisga'a or for young people in Attawapiskat to feel well? Young people in that community said something really interesting. They said, the things you might expect, like, opportunities to connect with elders, cultural language opportunities, sports, access to health services was one. Those are things I all expected to see. But what I did not expect to see, which kind of blew my mind, was dust control. And then at the very end, a meeting with the Prime Minister of Canada. That would help make young people well in this community. Dust control shocked me for a number of reasons, but as I began to dig into it, I learned that the living conditions, were ones where there was constantly diminished air quality because of the conditions of the mining in the region. And it's true in many parts of Canada where there are intensifying extractive industrial interest in indigenous land, not only is the water quality threatened, but the very air that we're breathing is deeply impacted by an increasing toxicity or pollution that you can point to directly the impacts of increased industrialization of extraction. And what I think is fascinating about this example is like those young people were just asked an open-ended question about like what would help make life better for young people in this community, what would help you feel well. And they pointed very directly to, yes, the kind of things we might say is like maybe the conventional approaches to like promoting well-being and health and wellness, but they also pointed to very material things that tell us something about the conditions of environmental justice, injustice that First Nations, among other Indigenous communities, are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. So to go back to your question, I think that there will only continue to be an increasing recognition of the role of environmental violence as a context or an ecological dimension of health issues like suicide. But I would maybe want to go even more further, like as an Indigenous studies intervention, to say that I think suicide can tell us something about the conditions of land, that we don't just have to think about the environmental justice as a way of understanding what's happening when we see increases of death, but we know that that's the assumptions and the assertions of Indigenous studies is that these are not unidirectional, that the condition of our people often is a reflection of the condition of spaces and the places where we live our lives, and land is suffering. If the land is suffering, the people will suffer. And vice versa. When the people are well, the land has to also be well. And if it isn't, then there's actually a question about how well are we. So that kind of, I think there's an opportunity for us to think about these like interrelationships of environmental justice and health justice in ways that are, bidirectional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was thinking about like sort of more well-known examples, such as like the suicides amongst Indian farmers in the last like decade. They've been tracking this, and this is because of sort of like structural sort of market reforms, and then like the relationship that these farmers have with land. And there's obviously a direct link, to those. I'm also thinking about sort of other epidemiological issues such as fentanyl or opioid use, and how when I guess like these things affect Indigenous or marginalized or racialized communities in a certain way, they're talked about in ways of like, well, maybe if you just pulled yourself up by the bootstraps, and maybe if you weren't a quote unquote gangbanger, or weren't this or weren't that, you made the wrong decisions in life. But then when it starts affecting white people and their families, then it becomes, it's a structural issue with the pharmaceutical companies, right? And I always think about this in terms of like, like how we imagine the things that you just described. And I hate to do this, but it's like, what if we did like a kind of like reversal of this? Like, what if tomorrow we told Canadians that you can no longer follow the British royalty? Like, you can no longer speak English. People would lose their minds. It's just a cultural issue, right? But they can't understand the sort of, and they'll kind of diminish or romanticize or mythologize or abstract our relationship to land as like, oh, well, it's a creation story. That's a nice story. But like that's not really like, that's not something that's material. And it's like, but if we take away, one aspect of your culture, I just think of the British royal family, because it's like, who cares about them? But people do really care about them. And they'd probably be really mad if people didn't, because that's their origin story. That's their creation story is, this inbred like family. And, that's about opulence and wealth and monarchy and whatnot. And they get really offended by that. I'm making a point here. I'm trying to make a point.
It's clear. It's clear.
Okay. But I think those sort of factors, it's like, sure, yes, everybody drinks water. Obviously, that's a fact of life. But when you have a deep historical connection to a place and you destroy that place, you're destroying a people's history. When you take away a people's history, you're also taking away a sense of futurity, a sense of dignity. And we think of, like you're wearing a t-shirt that says Palestine on it, right? There's no clear example that exists, not only in the ways that settler colonialism was a 21st century phenomenon and process. It's not something that exists in the 19th century. And it really made me upset when commentators were saying, this is 19th century colonial barbarity. And it's like, these are people in Canada and the United States. It's like, no, this is 21st century settler colonialism. You have controlled every aspect of life within, a small, narrow strip of land of 2.1 million people, half of whom are young people, right? You've controlled the flow of water. You've admitted to this. You've controlled the flow of food. And it's like, take a step back and look at where you are, and just reading the materials that you sent me about hydro-colonialism, as you call it, or hydro-colonial affects. It's like, there is also a level of control, not only a level of physical control over drinkable water and water infrastructure that leads to certain life outcomes and death outcomes, but also an effective control over how those deaths are perceived and mourned. Sure, we live, you point out very poignantly that we live in a constant, or these communities live in a constant state of mourning, right? Which also is a kind of form of, I would say, affective colonialism, because it's like there can only, like, indigeneity is then consigned to the sort of the forever, negative or negation. But you brought up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is a question that I had. It's like, are we reaching the limits of settler sympathies? Does a Truth and Reconciliation Commission set a sort of boundary of like, now now that Canadians are done mourning, they want Native people to stop essentially like whining and complaining? Are we, because we see this sort of attack on DEI initiatives and conflating them with Indigenous issues. And, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on this, because I was thinking about, you're talking about affect, and I understand you're talking about it in a certain way, but I'm also thinking about the sort of settler affect of being like, well, this is too much. What can we do?
Well, I think people don't like well, hold on. I think powerful people do not like bad feelings. I use this language of bad feelings, hard feelings more and more, because I think what I'm speaking about is like this negative register of emotional life, where we can talk very honestly about these sort of violent settler colonial conditions for so long in the presence of whiteness or in the presence of colonial power before it gets like, oh, but you're just pessimist. You're just hopeless. You need to move on. You need to heal. Actually, where there is a great degree of forced discourse around the concept of healing, I'm very suspicious. I do think we need to take seriously the kind of words from the street that reconciliation is a dead project. I say that as like a sort of very like personally my family gives testimony in the TRC. My grandmother and grandfathers before her all went to residential school as a part of the settlement, and believed that their story, in sharing the testimony in my mom's submission to the TRC, believed that by doing so, they took a great act of like love and faith in a people that hadn't shown that kind of faith in them. They gave a very beautiful offering in the work of the TRC. But I think I tend to agree with the assessment that this is particularly reconciliation is imagined as a sort of state sanctioned and run and governed project of transitional justice is one that is limited and constrained by the maintenance of settler colonial power. like to really implement the calls to action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission would involve the reimagining of the state, like the implementation of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People decades before. It would fundamentally alter what it means to live in this supposed country. And I don't think there was ever an appetite for its like full realization. And you only have to look give a cursory look at the places where calls to action have been taken up are places that are deeply commensurate with the performance and the symbolic nature of like multicultural relationships. It's never, I mean, while the reconciliation prime minister gets to celebrate, all the cool art in his office, his government has sued Indigenous peoples who are demanding like that their kids get the same amount of money for healthcare. And so I think for me, it's always felt like a deep contradiction. And I say that, I guess, with a deep belief that there are some Canadians, non-Indigenous people in this country who believe that, the promise of it. But yeah, I don't think we should be under any illusion about the end of settler colonial technologies and practices that work in our lives. In fact, we are better served by naming them as pernicious as they are, because if we don't, we're going to constantly be rerouted through the same forms of response that actually don't fix stuff. Anytime we talk about mental health, I get immediately channeled to we need greater accessible, culturally safe health services. And, I'm all in for that. Please, let's have more health service providers. There's literally 12 Indigenous psychologists in Canada. That's ridiculous, right? But we need more health services, but that is actually not the answer to what's happening in a community that has had their water poisoned for 30 years, where the only source of clean water after the government forcibly resettled them was to go to a tap that was installed only in the RCMP officer's home. That's not what's happening in places like Massachusetts and Alberta, where, in the 1970s, the Berger Commission suggested that when they were going to start building these pipelines out of Alberta into the Yukon to transport crude, that this might have serious social and health impacts on Indigenous people in the 1970s. I mean, these are ongoing forms of not just environmental, but political state sanctioned violence, fully knowing the human impact of it. I mean, Israel knows what it's doing when it shuts off water. It's not benign or unknown in some way. They know exactly what they are doing to an entire group of people. This is, I think, we're better served by not letting these myths about ourselves proliferate, about our kind of collective cultural benevolence. I think in this sense, we need to bear witness and not be so quick to be pulled into politics of consolation, while also not becoming too abstract from the very proximal ways in which this kind of loss and this kind of pain, and indeed depression, when you're in it, all you need is immediate help. So there's we can't truncate it all into one critique. It's not just a critique of state violence at the negation of a care for the kind of proximal pain and distress that people are going through. But if we only ever think about healing in this way that's very individual, we will have the same report in 20 years telling us the same thing that it told us in 1970. These will be unremitting conditions, and in many sense will only increasingly worsen if we fail to address the state structured ways in which this kind of despair is produced. there's my rant. I'll pause there. I don't know. I kind of went on a thread.
No, it's I think it's very important. It was thinking, it made me think of like two things. Like one is this idea of like reconciliation is dead. That was a hashtag that was very much popularized in the lead up to COVID-19, before it kind of became, before it kind of, like, I guess, was fully unleashed in Canada and the United States. But there was, rail blockades, all to support the Wet'suwet'en struggle, who had the slogan of, heal our bodies, heal the land. And it's not an abstract thing. And, I think I know one of the 12 Native or Indigenous psychologists in Canada, but somebody like Dr. Carla Tate, who was one of the matriarchs out at Wet'suwet'en. I actually went to grad school with her. At the university. Oh yeah, there you go.
Yeah, we actually, when she finished her PhD, she went and did a residency at the University of Manitoba, and that's where we met. We interviewed together, and then both ended up doing our residency training together then. But yeah, I mean, there's I think like a incredible example of somebody who like really gets that the material struggle to defend land, to defend Inta, is like the struggle of our lives. If we fail to do that, like if there's no clean water, if there's no clean air, if the ground is poisoned, it's like a future where none of us live. And I can't say enough good things about Carla.
No, she's a dear friend. And, but I think what was fascinating about those demands, I guess I know two of the 12, because you would be considered one, right? Yeah. So anyways, but part of that demand, it wasn't radical because it was just taking up what one of the calls of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it was saying that for us to heal, to overcome this historical trauma, is like we actually need clean drinking water. And the only way to have it is to stop this pipeline from coming in. And that's not them saying it. They're using the language that the state has deployed against itself. It's a form of imminent critique, right? You're using the values that the system professes and trying to uphold those values. That's not radical. That's just asking Canada to uphold its own commitments, right? But then it gets framed in this way where it's like this actual alternative, where there is healing going on. It's a collective healing, not only of the people who are engaged in the struggle and movement, but it's also a healing of the land itself, then becomes criminalized and turned into a sort of quote unquote terrorist, because of the RCMP community relations group that was created in the aftermath of Standing Rock, but then to specifically target, this Wet'suwet'en struggle. So it's like even the alternatives, and this is, the sort of kind of question that I had when I was reading a lot of these things that you had written. The alternatives themselves also become sort of pathologized as violent, as criminal, as irrational. They were portraying Native people in Standing Rock who were engaged in, ceremony, who called themselves water protectors, as violent jihadists, jihadist-inspired movement. And when you think about the way Western media is portraying, like the struggle in Palestine, they're portraying it in the same way. They are religious extremists who are irrational, who are invested in death, right? Because they glorify martyrdom, right? It's the same sort of language of, the other, of the colonial sort of, this idea that we are the savages, not, the system itself is the one who's inflicting the violence, right? So when you have an alternative, and I think about this, and we all do need healing. I'm not against healing. I'm pro healing. Like I think we're all pro healing here. But it's how that healing manifests. And I think of, I saw a little bit of it in the writings you sent me, but I do want to hear your thoughts, because I think one of the most profound experiences that I've had has been in struggle. Like, even though there are these situations that you put yourself in where they are high risk, and there are, There are people who are getting pepper sprayed, arrested, their livelihoods taken away, their children threatened, all kinds of things. The FBI is going to call you. They're going to do a knock and talk, or the RCMP is going to show up at your door, threaten to take away your children, slap charges on you, prevent you from crossing the border, like the whole gamut, subpoena you, do all these things to terrify you. To think of the action where you felt the most free in participating, where I saw, I'm not the only one. This isn't, just my experience, but I saw people who I knew in community who struggled with addiction, who struggled with, alienation, who struggled with, suicidal ideation and having, being depressed and isolated within their own community, engage in acts of not just like resistance by like chaining themselves to a pipeline or whatever, but also engage in acts of community where they set the terms. Like, and there was, they like lined out. They, began to sort of like the sort of, I guess I don't know how to say this, but it's like, it was just an awakening for them, where they're allowed to be themselves. And it was often said, it's like, this is how our ancestors lived. Not in this way of like, we're all riding horses and, living in teepees, even though we were doing
that could be fun.
That could be fun. But then like, having that experience, and it's similar in other instances. Like I remember, there was talk during these kind of moments of the Black Lives Matter movement, where communities that had been historically sort of like gang territory, like came together in their, not only their hatred of the police and the violence that they inflicted on that community, but also to say, we need to redefine what safety means for our community, And so it's like, you've invested all this money in these suicide prevention programs. And I'm not like trying to critique these. I believe in healing or gang remediation and prevention programs, but why is it in the moment of uprising, these people feel more connected and more grounded in their communities?
Well, it's interesting, like sociologists would say that suicide occurs at the population level in the greatest concentrations of social and economic inequality. But it's not just social and economic inequality. It's when there is an experience of powerlessness in that inequality. So I think that sounds like, in a way, pretty intuitive to me to go like, you've got a group of people who are experiencing very real experiences of, like, let's never oversimplify it. These are very real experiences of depression or very real experiences of grief and loss or despair. That when you build collective power with one another, you are countering the very dimension of that sort of risk environment that produces the greatest, maybe lethal threat. But I think it's more than that, because it's not just about like building power. I also think it's this is where I maybe lose the classic materialist, but I guess I think it's spiritual. And I do really like believe this more and more when I talk to, like, especially young people navigating the desire to die. I often say, like, now I speak from a place of like welcoming that set of feelings. Like, wow, like what you are experiencing, like you may not have heard people talk about it this way, but like you are at the beginning of a spiritual revolution. Like your life, if you navigate this moment, your life will forever be changed because of what you're about to learn. And like, I guess I see these moments of struggle where my own life has been buoyed by collectivity, where like I stumble upon and interrupted by joy or hope through solidarity, through the use of my body as a means of defense against annihilation. Those moments to me are, I mean, I use this word spiritual because I don't have another word that comes close to what I mean by it, but I think it is like it's connective in a way that like brings us I mean, you mentioned the connection to ancestors, like this is how our ancestors would have lived. But I think in a way we're kind of speaking to the same piece, which is that it's deeply pedagogical, it's informative, it's instructive around who we are. I think I just had this really interesting meeting recently with a First Nations doula, a midwife in Australia, and we were talking about this very thing that she does now suicide prevention work, but through her practice as a doula. And she talks about like how these experiences where we come close to death, where we come close to annihilation in one form or another, we have the opportunity in those moments to come close to our creation stories. And that for me is kind of what I see in what you're describing about people living on the front lines of some of the most brutal forms of police and state violence, quite literally marked for settler colonial erasure. That in that struggle, I actually think we are coming as close as we possibly can to our creation stories, where like the potential of what the world could be, what we can do to make a world worth living in. I think that is like a deeply creative act that holds a lot of not only political but personal possibility for individuals and for communities. It's the only way that a person who is suicidal lives. The only way that happens is by imagining a world worth living in. That's it. There's no other path. You have to imagine a life that you want to inhabit. So every time I meet somebody who's navigated that journey, I think like something has kept you here. And I guess I offer the one caveat that doesn't mean a failure on the part of those who have died by suicide. But I think it's more of an invitation to those of us who are living and bearing witness to people's struggle to be a part of actively forming conditions that are conducive to thriving. That to me is like our responsibility to one another. And I think that when we're struggling together on the front lines or in an action, or when people are quite literally chaining themselves to pipelines, these are acts that make possible living into the future. And even sometimes in people's, I mean, the more difficult thing to talk about, which doesn't feel so rosy, is that sometimes people's deaths are a witness. They are a story. And I think we have to do work, particularly in Indigenous communities, to not only speak of deaths by suicide as tragedy, but also to speak of deaths by suicide as an important story with an important teaching, and to bear witness to people's insistence that we make the world better. To me, that there's a way of talking about suicides that doesn't pathologize or abandon the political indictment which it offers, even though it is painful, even though it is like world-ending for some of us. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really profound, and I think it's a good place to end this conversation. I just want to make one final comment about this, is because I think that's the spirituality component is what it's like. I was listening to I was reading a Guardian article the other day, and it was they were talking about this turn to spirituality within the Palestinian movement, and saying how it was, quote unquote, this expert they had interviewed was saying how irrational it was. And I was thinking about our own movements, because if you go back, you don't have to go too far back. You can look at the water protector movement, or you can look at 19th century, physical resistance to colonialism. And they would point to they would target the spiritual leaders first. And they're providing an irrational, resistance to this settler colonial system. And I would say, though, like, it's not irrational. It's a very rational response, because it gives you that immaterial substance, right? That nobody can really quite explain. It kind of exists beyond the kind of realms of science and secularism about why people want to live a better life, right? It's not just you can have clean drinking water, you can have a clean environment, you can have all these things, but you can also look at the rates of suicide within developed, quote unquote, developed countries, and compare them to quote unquote undeveloped countries, and try to understand why is it in developed countries there are higher rates of suicide, and I think this is a little, just a question that, I'm not saying everyone needs to like turn to God, like that's not the point, but I'm saying though that it's like what you just said, like this, you're on like the first step, I guess, of your spiritual revolution or spiritual journey. And I think that is an important thing to realize, because it's like, it does give you that sort of purpose and grounding that, you can go to all the therapy sessions you want, but until you have that, it's not going to really, it doesn't really click. And I would say like Indigenous movements within North America and throughout the world have always centered that. And it has always been the sort of thing for which we are most vilified or demonized for, because it's an irrational sort of response to annihilation. And I would say, no, it's actually a very rational response to annihilation. Your response and turn towards secularism, that in sort of trying to rationalize a system that is built on our annihilation, is actually going to lead us continually down the path of destruction and annihilation. So I was like just thinking about that as you were talking. Maybe that's a word vomit, but I think it was really powerful what you said.
I mean, it's something I'm working through and thinking about a lot, because I think to introduce spirituality as a way of talking about this is a risk, because sometimes that just gets so immediately transposed into like a kind of escapism, or a kind of like non-material struggle, or something that is very abstract. But I think when I think about spirituality, it's very fleshy. It's like, it's anthropologists want to learn about Indigenous people's ceremonies. I want us to live a ceremony, just live it. Like every action, every word, every deed is a expression of creating and recreating the world over. But also like, the tough thing too is that sometimes that deep conviction can lead to personal suffering. I was thinking just also of like the life of Nelson Smalley Jr., who was an activist, a defender of Indigenous lands in Alberta in the 1970s, who days after speaking to the Berger Commission about the potential harm that industrial development in Alberta would bring, died by suicide, and left an indicting letter speaking to the ways in which he hoped that his death would bring accountability and bring a wave of resistance to the Crown's encroachment on Cree territory. And when I tell this story, people get nervous, right? Because they're like, "Oh, don't valorize this death." I don't actually want to make a judgment upon it. But what I want to say is that being in the struggle does not make us immune to suffering, or to the potential of hopelessness, or the potential of being of having one's life end. But I think that we're sitting here talking about him because his life bears witness to a love for place and a people. And I think that if there's like a takeaway towards like a spirituality that is grounded, it's to struggle to live, and struggle with the desire to die, with a deep love for people and for the land. I think like however it plays out, we can't know from our position. but we will become something otherwise, and the direction of our life will alter if we do it and ground it in a place that's guided by that kind of commitment to one another and to the protection and future world of our lands. To me, that is like that's a challenge, and a worthy one, I think, but one that I also think like we need to value what these hard feelings offer us as teachings. Like rethinking about suicide this way has helped me greet depression as a guest. It's helped me to show hospitality to those like moments in my own life or in my community where I would have wanted to like get through it really quick. I now like kind of greet it and go, there's something here that I have to work through. There's something here that I have to walk through, and it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be overnight, but I will be changed in this. I will grow in this, and we will transform together through this struggle. And I think, yeah, a good life is born out of that kind of struggle. At least that's how I see it.
That's really beautiful. And I don't know. It's like you can't go around it. You have to go through it. You know, that's the kind of very simple kind of way to put a point on it. But I really appreciate you taking the time, Jeff, for talking with us today. This has actually helped me think about things. Like we didn't really get too much into. I printed off everything. I have a pile of papers. But it helped me like rethink a lot of things, and it has changed my thinking a lot about this and my relationship to it. Because, yeah, I mean, it is therapeutic in some ways, in ways that are, I think, productive and geared towards justice and not just like a broader social sense, but also in my relations with people in my own family. And so, I really appreciate you kind of taking the time and explaining some of these things and giving some of your insights. Where can people find your work? Are you online? Do you have a social media handle? Do you have anything that you want to promote?
Sure. Yeah, I can give you the links, but I'm also, I'm on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter at Jeffrey Ansloos, or you can follow me on Blue Sky, I guess. You can also find me on Facebook, and in terms of like, that's probably where I share the bulk of my work day to day. I write into a lot of different places. I write into Indigenous studies, I write into social theory and politics and in psychology. So you can always find me on Google Scholar and find all my articles linked there if you want. But if you want to connect, the best way to reach me is to connect over Twitter or Instagram or wherever, or email, and always happy to hear from folks. These topics do bring up a lot for people, and whatever it brings up for people, I think one thing we talk a lot about when I like give talks about this in places, especially in communities where I know this is like kind of happening in the moment, is like if something comes up for you, I always just say like stay a minute longer. You can go, no one's going to police you or anything, but like stay just a little bit longer and let's connect. And so if stuff comes up for people today too, like even though it's virtual, I would say stay a minute longer and like do reach out. Always happy to hear from folks and to talk. And if I'm not the right person, I'm always happy to like connect you to somebody else. And I guess that's all I wanted to say.